Let's talk about Leviticus 25. I'm going to assume that if you are watching this video, you have probably been watching all throughout the Leviticus video series, or at the very least that you've been reading along in Leviticus up to this point. So I'm going to assume that you basically know where we are, what is going on, and so forth. So I'm not going to do a ton of recap. I'm just going to pick up exactly where we left off. Because when we left off in our last video in Leviticus 24, we were talking about the way that the ancient Israelites were called to prepare themselves for worship each day by the way they dealt with common everyday life stuff. Essentially, Leviticus was teaching the ancient Israelites to prepare themselves to worship the Lord through how they handled every other part of their lives. Essentially, the way that you handled every other part of society was a preparation for worship. The way you handled your relationships, the way you handled your money, the way that you handled your property, the way that you handled other people who wronged you, the way you handled your kids, the way you handled your friends, the way you handled your animals, the way that you handled your crops, and on and on and on. All of these things were a form of preparation for worship. Remember, you as the people of God, you are a people who has been atoned for by the long-promised Savior who was to come. You are a people who have had your sin taken care of. You have had the barriers between you and God knocked down. So one day you will have a full and unlimited, unvarnished, unhindered fellowship with God. And today you kind of rehearse that fellowship. You image that unhindered fellowship that is coming one day in eternity future today through the rituals you perform, the sacrifices you perform. Kind of metaphorically speaking, it is as if you are sharing a meal with the Lord. So you are the atoned for people of God who now celebrate the fellowship that you are able to have with Him by sharing a meal with Him regularly through these sacrifices and rituals in the tabernacle worship. But Leviticus is teaching us that worship does not just happen in the context of these tabernacle or temple rituals. Worship happens in every aspect of our lives. We worship in every other part of our lives, day after day after day, and we worship in this very unique and very specific way together in the tabernacle, sharing a meal with the Lord, sacrificing to the Lord, making offerings in gratitude to the Lord, and on and on and on. There is not one corner of our lives that is not intended to be a form of worship. That is still true today. It simply looks differently. But here in Leviticus, during the days of the ancient Israelites, Leviticus 24 laid out a long list of ways that we prepare for that kind of really acute tabernacle worship by worshiping in all these other parts of our lives, very specifically with things like dealing justly with criminals. That actually dealing in a just way with criminals is an act of worship to the Lord. Making sure that the punishments that you dole out are proportional and reasonable, not excessive. That is an act of worship to the Lord. Making sure that everyone, whether they are native born or foreign, is treated justly and equally and fairly under the law. That is an act of worship to the Lord. And on and on and on and on. And that same thing applies here in Leviticus 25. So we're continuing on in the same big picture concept, but we're looking at it in a very different set of situations. Leviticus 25 starts to lay down what it would look like for the ancient Israelites to deal justly when it comes to work, when it comes to wealth, when it comes to poverty, and beyond. Essentially, it says, we worship the Lord when we deal justly and righteously with how we think about work and workers, how we think about wealth and acquiring that wealth and what to do with that wealth, and how we think about poverty and how we deal with poverty and how we treat people who are trapped in the cycle of poverty, and how we arrange society so that the cycle of poverty is harder to fall into and the ladder of wealth is easier to get onto and ascend through honest, hard work. So this is very similar to what we were talking about just a few chapters earlier. Justice in the true definition, rather than the weird ideological definitions that the kind of left wing and right wing and so forth political goons in our kind of present day have redefined it to be. The true definition of justice, the biblical definition of justice, basically comes down to taking away the obstacles that prevent people from reaping the good rewards of the hard, honest work they have sown, and also taking away the corruption and bribery and favoritism and other things along those lines that prevent people from reaping the just consequences and punishments that their crimes and exploitation and oppression and stealing and so on and so forth have sown. So in a just situation that honors the Lord, a person, whether they are an average person or a member of the government or a cultural leader or a mega donor or the president or king or prime minister or whatever, wherever they are on the totem pole, they will be justly punished for their crimes. And a person who does hard, honest work, who actively acquires wisdom and then applies that wisdom in order to be productive and so on and so forth, both of them will typically get either the reward or punishment for the direction they have chosen and the effort they have poured into it and the wisdom involved and so on and so forth. Sowing wickedness in a just society will lead to punishment, and in the same way, sowing honest, hard, wise work will lead, at the very least, to being able to get by reasonably well in a just society. And a just society will reflect the justice of the Lord. It will reflect the fairness of the Lord. So building the most just society we can is an act of worship. And quite a bit of Leviticus, as well as Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, deal pretty specifically with what a just society would look like in the context of the ancient Near East. So we don't necessarily want to copy and paste these exact same rules in our own setting, because things that would have pulled the ancient Near Eastern culture toward justice that reflects the Lord in a way that would actually make sense and work at that point in time are not necessarily the same exact things that would pull our society toward justice. Our society has somewhat different problems that need somewhat different rules that address those problems. Just like their society had somewhat different problems that would need somewhat different rules to address those problems. But what does not change is the big picture principles of godly justice and righteousness. And so those big principles of God's justice, righteousness, and fairness will lead any society that is made up primarily of the people of God, influenced primarily by the people of God, to pass specific laws, specific rules, and so on and so forth in order to pull our particular society towards that justice. And so ancient Israel in the ancient Near East, in that culture in which women, for all of living memory, and then generation after generation after generation, had functionally been property rather than citizens, people, members of the society, the same way that their husbands and sons and so forth would have been. The specific rules that you need to operate on in order to pull that society towards justice as it relates to dealing with women are different than the rules you need to operate on today in order to pull society toward justice as it relates to women. Same thing is true when it comes to foreigners, immigrants, and so on and so forth. As the people of God, we are called to deal justly with immigrants, foreigners, and so on and so forth. Blood and soil is part of the pagan mindset of the lost nations that the Lord literally cleared out of the promised land. The notion of protecting our ancestral homeland for heritage Americans, that is a godless pagan mindset, even if you slap a bunch of out-of-context Bible verses onto it. No matter what the situation is, no matter what the context is, we have to deal justly with foreigners, immigrants, and so forth. However, that doesn't mean that we need to have the exact same rules as ancient Israel did. Because these specific individual rules throughout Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are meant to pull that particular society toward God's justice, righteousness, fairness, but it would take a different set of specific rules in order to do the same thing for our own society. So we're aiming at the same big picture principles, but we may have different rules. You can apply that to literally any of the other issues that Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy deal with throughout the ancient Mosaic law. We need to create a society that is just towards the disabled, like Leviticus talked about just a few chapters ago, but that doesn't mean the exact same rules need to be passed by our own legal system. We need to be just towards laborers and workers, but that doesn't mean we need the exact same rules that they had. We need to be just toward the poor, those who are unable to get up onto the first rung of the ladder so they can then ascend to the second, third, fourth, and so forth. But that doesn't mean we need the exact same rules. And on and on and on and on. And that is one of the reasons why you will sometimes see in the law of Moses, it will say, when a person does this persistently and unrepentantly, you should stone them to death. But then at other points, we will see him say, do not stone that person to death, even though they have committed this thing that technically makes them liable to be stoned to death, and other things along those lines. That's one of the reasons why, in one context, the law of Moses says, do not marry your brother's wife. Do not sleep with your brother's wife. But in a very different context, we see it saying, if this happens, then you should marry your brother's wife. You should sleep with her. You should have a child with her, and other things like that. The same big picture principles of godly justice and righteousness are being applied in totally different situations. And that means that you may have very different rules that seem at first like they contradict each other, but when you understand the purpose behind it, they don't. This is a really long tangent. We need to get into the specifics of Leviticus 25, sorry. But I actually cannot remember if we talked specifically about all of this stuff on this same level in the earlier videos or not. So I want to make sure I get it in there because I know that there will be questions about these things if I don't explicitly bring them up. But Leviticus 25 is in that same vein. It's talking about rules for justly dealing with work and wealth and poverty. So you are worshiping the Lord by being a community and a culture, being a nation and a people that deals justly as it relates to work and wealth and poverty. But in order to understand the specific laws that they're going to dive into here, some of which seem kind of strange to us, we need to understand the foundations that they are resting on. We need to understand the fundamental realities about God that ultimately these very specific rules related to work and wealth and poverty and land and so forth flow out from in that specific context among the ancient Near Eastern Israelites. So let's talk about those. First things first, foundation number 1. Leviticus 25:23, it says, "The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and live as foreigners with me." This is foundation number 1. It's that God owns all the land. Now, I'm going to go ahead and throw the rest of this in here. I quoted one verse. There are quite a few more that we're going to talk about, but I'm going to go ahead and throw just the whole big picture in here, okay? He says, the land is mine. And as we're going to see throughout the rest of this chapter, and as we've already seen throughout the rest of Leviticus, that same thing is true for all the animals. The animals belong to Yahweh. And as we have already seen, the harvests and the crops, everything we grow, belongs to Yahweh. And the same thing is true for us. The workers belong to Yahweh. The people belong to Yahweh. We belong to Yahweh. So he's about to talk about something called the Sabbath year, where every 7th year you have to quite literally take off of all non-essential work. There is a year where you barely do any work at all. Not you, not your workers, not your servants, not your slaves, not your animals, not your land, not your anything. That's really weird. There's going to be another thing, the year of Jubilee, where every 50 years you have to give back everything that you have gained by way of debt or other things like that. You have to set free anyone who has become your slave through unpayable debts and blah, 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 and so on and so forth. We're going to talk about a whole bunch of other things once we get into chapter 27, when it talks about making vows to the Lord and all this different stuff. But all these things are basically built on this foundation. God owns all the land and animals and workers and beyond, not us. That's foundation number 1. None of the rest of the stuff in this chapter makes any sense if you don't grasp that foundation. But at the same time, there's another type of concrete mixed in to make that foundation. And that is this, foundation number 2. God's design is for all people to be self-sustaining. Leviticus 25:13 says, "In this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his property." Now we're going to talk about the year of Jubilee in depth in a little bit. But first things first, let's talk about this. God's created design for humanity, for the world, for everything is not for there to be a handful of people who own everything, have everything, are in charge of everything, control everything, and take care of everybody else. That is not how God designed the world to be. God designed everything in order to be basically self-sustaining, in the sense that pretty much everybody is meant to take care of themselves as much as they are able to. Pretty much everybody is meant to own property to the extent that they are able to. Pretty much everybody is meant to contribute to the common good as much as they are able to. Pretty much everybody is meant to have their own home, have their own land, have their own crops, have their own animals, have their own whatever. Productive property. That's kind of the economic term for it. Productive property is what you call it when you have the means to be able to make a living for yourself. Another term for that would be like the means of production. A lot of times when we hear that word, the means of production, we think of Karl Marx, right? We think of like the Communist Manifesto. He says you got to seize the means of production, but that's actually the opposite of what we're talking about here. Because in a kind of communist society, the state seizes the means of production. And so the state owns all the productive property, and then everybody else gets to use the productive property, at least in theory. Rarely actually goes that way in practice. Remember the Soviet Union and so on and so forth. And so that's the opposite of this. In a communist society, the government, which is typically a relatively small group of people, owns the means of production and then, at least in theory, is supposed to let everybody else use it. But at the same time, in a, you could say like corporatist society or a cronyist society, or there's a whole lot of different names for it. But often what happens instead is that a relatively small group of sort of private individuals or businesses and so on and so forth own the overwhelming majority of the means of production. And everyone just has to kind of work for them in order to make enough money in order to maybe buy some food from other people who are just working for somebody else trying to make some money to buy some food and stuff like that. Almost everybody is renting homes that are owned by other landlords who own 200, 300, 400, 500 units that they just rent out to everybody. And so the majority of the actual fruits of everyone's labor is going over there, and the majority of people are just kind of hustling as much as they can in order to kind of stay caught up on bills and debt and other things like that. That is not the way that the Lord created us to be. And so these two very, very different situations still kind of end up in the same way. Whether you have a communist society where the government owns all of the productive property, owns all the things that make it possible to make a living, or you live in a totally kind of private society where a handful of very wealthy and powerful people own almost all of the productive property and the means of production, you still basically have the same result. Whether you live in Cuba or you live in a kind of hyper-privatized wasteland, almost everybody is essentially under the thumb of a very small group of sort of power brokers. This is what the Christian philosopher and economist and political theorist Hilaire Belloc from the early 20th century referred to as the servile state. He says, a society where most people are relatively comfortable, but almost nobody actually owns anything, is still a bad situation. It's better than a situation where everybody's poor and dying, but it's still not actually what the Lord intended. Because God's intention, His design, is for basically everyone to be as self-sustaining as possible. G.K. Chesterton, he's one of my favorite authors. He was a Christian, actually he was a lot of things. He was a Christian political theorist, Christian novelist, Christian essayist, Christian philosopher, Christian theologian, Christian apologist. G.K. Chesterton is credited for having converted more people to Christianity during the 20th century than almost anybody else combined. He was basically forgotten about by the second half of the 20th century. But he is the reason C.S. Lewis became a Christian ultimately. He is the reason so many others did. But he always joked, and this was not meant to be taken ultra literally, but he said the ideal situation is one where just about everybody has about 3 acres and a cow. You can have more, but at the very, very least, most people have about 3 acres and a cow. Everybody has about enough land to be able to grow things. Everybody has about enough land in order to be able to maintain at least some livestock. Everybody has about enough land to really be productive. And he always said the way that you get there is not for the government to come steal a bunch of land from people and then redistribute it so that everybody's got, a few acres and some animals. He said the way that you get there is for the government to stop stealing land from everybody else and giving it to a few people, which is literally, functionally, what happens in so many places even to this day. But it was even worse in the ancient Near East. And so we're going to get to all that. But foundation number 2 that we have to understand is that God's design, His intent, is for everyone to be self-sustaining. There are always going to be people who in some way need to be taken care of, such as the disabled and so on and so forth. But the norm is meant to be just about everybody uses their own two hands to support themselves, uses their own acquired wisdom to support themselves, and has the tools and resources to do that, is not hindered or blocked by the government or the community from doing that. That's foundation number 2. Foundation number 3 is this: we can and must trust the Lord to provide faithfully each year. Leviticus 25 verses 20, 22 says, if you said, what shall we eat the 7th year, that is during the Sabbath year, behold, we shall not sow or gather in our increase, then I will command my blessing on you in the 6th year, and I shall bear fruit for the 3 years. You shall sow the 8th year and eat of the fruits, the old store, until the 9th year, until its fruits come in, you shall eat the old store. Now we're going to talk about the Sabbath year in depth in just a bit, like I said. But the important thing for us to catch there in just that little snippet is that the Lord is going to faithfully provide, and we must trust Him to faithfully provide. You cannot do something like the Sabbath year where you take an entire year off of planting and harvesting and so forth if the Lord has not faithfully provided everything you need in the 6 years leading up to it, so that you will have enough saved up to be able to subsist for that year where you cannot plant and harvest and beyond. And so there's 3 big foundational things we have to understand. There is a God who owns all of the land, all of the animals, all of the harvest, all of the workers, and us. And that God who owns all the land and animals and workers and so forth intends for all people to be self-sustaining, at least to the extent that it is possible and achievable. And that this God who owns absolutely everything and intends for everyone to be self-sustaining rather than hyper-dependent on others and under the thumb of a small group of people, can and will faithfully provide for us each year, and we can trust Him to faithfully provide for us each year. And if we trust the Lord, we won't do things that rob other people of the ability to be self-sustaining. We won't build a society that makes it functionally impossible for most people to be self-sustaining. We won't build a society that exploits and abuses the land or the animals or the workers and so forth if we trust the Lord. Because ultimately so many of those things typically come from the belief that if I don't exploit, if I don't do wrong, if I don't hurry up and beat everybody else to the punch taking advantage, then I will be the one who ends up getting exploited and mistreated and taken advantage of. If I don't climb over everybody else in order to increase my own power and prestige and status and wealth, then I'm going to be one of the people who gets stepped over. What you are saying when you act out of that mindset is, I don't trust the Lord. What you're saying is, I have to be the God to protect me because I cannot trust the Lord to protect me if I live in line with His calling and commands and design. So, God owns all the land and animals and workers, not us. And His design is for all people to be self-sustaining, not under the thumb of a small group of people, not dependent on everybody else, not just constantly trying to catch up because they're completely at the mercy of a handful of power brokers over here. And we can trust Him to provide for us year after year after year if we live according to those foundational principles within which He designed the universe to work. So we do not have to create a wicked, unjust, idolatrous society of exploitation and abuse like the surrounding pagan nations. We worship the Lord by trusting Him enough to provide for us. That we build a community that reflects His godly justice and righteousness. And so within those foundational principles, there are a handful of specific laws. We've alluded to pretty much all of these already, but we're going to specifically tackle them now. Number one, because all of these things are true, land monopolies are prohibited. It says, Leviticus 25:10, you shall make the 50th year holy and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee to you, and each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family. So every 50 years you have something called the Jubilee year. What's going on with the Jubilee year? Here's what's going on. Every 50 years, land must be returned to those who lost it via debt or some other thing like that. If someone got so far into debt that they had no choice but to sell their land in order to be able to get out of it, in order to avoid becoming enslaved, or in order to avoid losing their families or something else along those lines, whatever the case, if you acquired someone else's family lands because of their misfortune and so on and so forth, you only get to keep it for 50 years. At the end of that 50-year period, the land has to go back to the person who lost it. Or if they have passed away, it goes back to their next in line, the head of the household in the next generation of their family. If you've already died, your children must return that land to their children, and on and on and on. You do not get to permanently acquire the land of someone who has fallen onto hard times. You do not get to take the family land away from their children and their children's children and their children's children's children, because this generation fell on hard times. Now, one of the reasons for this was to protect the family line of the person who fell on hard times and had to sell their land. If their children are landless, then their children have a major problem. If their grandchildren are landless, their grandchildren have a major problem. But that's not the only thing that's happening here. That is part of it, but it is not just about protecting the next generations by giving back their land. It is also about preventing land monopolies. In the ancient Near Eastern world, like we've talked about in a lot of the previous videos, in Genesis, Exodus, now Leviticus, but also just throughout the New Testament, especially the four Gospels, because this actually is in the background of so much of what is happening in the four Gospels in ways that get ignored a lot, right? But the norm throughout the ancient Near Eastern world was there were a handful of people who owned pretty much all the land, pretty much all the animals, pretty much all the livestock, all the crops, and so on and so forth, and everybody else just lived on their land. There were a handful of lords and then a whole bunch of serfs. And that meant that basically everybody was under the power of these relatively few lords. These very, very small groups of people pretty much controlled the lives of almost everybody else, which is naturally the opposite of what the Lord intends. How did that happen, though? That's the really good question. It didn't happen overnight. When the world was created, a handful of people didn't own everything. That's the thing that slowly happened over time. How did it happen over time? The way it happened was, once upon a time, there were a whole lot of families, a whole lot of households, a whole lot of tribes, a whole lot of peoples who all had a little bit of land. Maybe not literally 3 acres and a cow, but they had a little bit of land, a little bit of livestock. They had enough crops to be able to feed their own family and then sell the rest in order to financially get a little bit ahead and so on and so forth. But over years and centuries and millennia and so forth, what would happen? What would happen was that a family or household or whatever would fall on hard times and have to sell their land. And whoever bought that land now has quite a bit more and are therefore able to produce a whole lot more, be a lot more productive, make a whole lot more money, and in the process acquire a whole lot more wealth and power and influence. Which means what? That means the next time somebody falls on hard times, that same one that acquired this other family's lands and animals and harvests and so forth is in a position where they have a much easier time now acquiring the lands, animals, harvests, and so forth of this other family who has fallen on hard times. And so now they own not only their own family lands, but also this other one's family lands and also this other one's family lands. And then some time passes and another one falls on hard times. And now this one that has acquired two other families' lands has now acquired a third family's lands. And then some time passes, another one falls on hard times and they acquire a fourth family or household's lands, and then a fifth, and then a sixth, and then a seventh, and an eighth. Over several hundred years, what eventually happens is that this one family and household owns everything within a 200, 300, 400, 500 mile radius. They own everything. And you are born into a world where you will never own anything. You will forever just live on their land as their servant by their rules. You will work their harvests for barely enough to even feed yourself. You will take care of their animals for barely enough to care for your own needs. You will live in a little hut that they let you build on a little patch of their land that they can kick you out of at a moment's notice, and on and on. That was the norm in the ancient Near East. Over generations, tiny groups of people would gain full-on land monopolies, and everybody else would be completely under their thumb. But Yahweh says, no, that must not be how it is among my people. Instead, he says, if a family falls on hard times and has no choice but to sell their family land, whoever buys it gets 50 years, no more. Because in that 50th year, you must return the land to the next generation of their family. What does that do? That keeps the land within their family. So one, it keeps the next generation of their family from being totally helpless because they lost all of their productive property. And two, it keeps you from becoming an all-powerful feudal lord who owns everything. It keeps any one family from acquiring all the productive property, all the power, all the wealth, all the status, all the influence. This makes it impossible for you to seize the means of production, whether you are one person or you are a government. And so in ancient Israel, the absolute worst case scenario was that you lose your land for 50 years, but eventually it's going to be restored to you. But that was meant to be the worst case scenario. That was still not meant to be the norm. Because ideally, if God's people are being obedient to the Lord, then it wouldn't come to that in the first place. Here's why. It's because at exactly the same time, Leviticus 25 verse 25 says, if your brother becomes poor and sells some of his possessions, then his kinsman who is next to him shall come and redeem that which his brother has sold. So if hard times cause your brother or your close relative, whatever it is, to lose his property, so lose his livestock, lose rights to his fields, lose whatever it is, you as his brother, his close relative, are called to buy it back for him if you are able to, in order to keep the property within his family. Same thing. If he loses his lands, falls on hard times, and has no choice but to sell it, you as his brother or close relative are called to buy it back for him, to keep the land within his family, to avoid his land and his livestock and his crops and so on and so forth from being concentrated into fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer hands. So part of this is about protecting people who fall on hard times, absolutely, but at the same time, on an even bigger level, this is about making ancient Israel into a place that reflects the justice of Yahweh and the righteousness of Yahweh. It's meant to be a place where there is not a tiny group of power brokers, either private power brokers or government power brokers, who own everything and control everybody else's lives. It is meant to make ancient Israel reflect God's design, that the norm is for all people to be as self-sustaining as possible. That people have control over their own lives, are responsible for themselves, are empowered to care for themselves. You care for others in need when that need arises, but rather than just band-aid treating those needs when they arrive, because nobody can own anything, nobody can get up the ladder. Instead, what you do is you make the ladder lower. You keep it so that property is as dispersed as possible and lands are as dispersed as possible, so that most people don't need your charity. Most people don't need to come and harvest from the edges of your field. Most people don't need any of those things because they have their own fields. They have their own livestock. They have their own crops. They have their own homes. They have their own land. Essentially, the ancient Israelites are called to worship the Lord by creating a society where self-reliance, self-sufficiency, self-sustenance is actually possible within the bounds of what is reasonably attainable. This is the true version of self-sufficiency. I preached a message a while back. We were in the Psalms, and we were talking about how our modern culture has this kind of myth of self-sufficiency. I'm using the term self-sufficiency in a very different way here. When I talk about the myth of self-sufficiency in kind of modern American culture, I'm talking about the way that we largely have a society where the norm is for most people to be kind of forced into being renters and fight for the scraps and other things like that. Even if we technically have comparatively comfortable lives, the fact is that your great-grandparents had very simple, very minimalistic lives, but they were mostly in control of their fate. Whereas for a lot of the current generation, they are never going to own a house. They are never going to have the resources to start a small business. They are never going to be able to grow anywhere near enough of their own food. They are never going to be able to do a lot of things. They are going to spend pretty much their entire lives. Their kids are going to spend their entire lives. Their kids' kids are going to spend their entire lives working the cash register at somebody else's store, which is not an inherently bad thing, but it's absolutely an inherently bad thing when that is the norm. And so the myth of self-sufficiency that we were talking about a few weeks back, for anybody who goes to my church and was there, we're talking about the kind of false sense of self-sufficiency that ignores the factors that make it possible for us to acquire all of these different things. The idea that I built everything I have with my own two hands when your parents helped you with the down payment on your house. I acquired everything with my own two hands when, okay, well, you definitely would not have been able to start this business if there hadn't been roads built years and years ago. You probably were not going to build highway number 1. I built everything with my own two hands. Okay, your mom probably would not have been able to provide you the specific education that you needed in order to be able to figure out how to build any of these things with your own two hands. You went to a school that was collectively funded. You went to a college that would not have existed without significant donations by other people who are not you. The way that Russell Kirk, he's another very important kind of philosopher figure, from the early 20th century put it was that we stand on the shoulders of giants. The myth of self-sufficiency is what we call it when we forget that we stand on the shoulders of giants. So there's this false self-sufficiency where you are standing on the shoulders of giants and saying, I built everything myself. That's the norm in our culture. And then there's the kind of true self-sufficiency, which is not saying that you don't have to rely on the Lord or anything like that. But what it is talking about is you actually have the power and can access the resources that are necessary to be able to take care of yourself. And that is the goal. And we see that, number one, in the way that land monopolies are prohibited in ancient Israel. Every 50 years, the land has to be returned to whoever lost it via debt so that property ownership remains widespread among all the people, not concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. And that before it even gets to that, if at all possible, when hard times cause your brother or close relative to lose his land or property, if you can, you buy it back for him to keep the property within his family and avoid it being concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. That's number one. So let's talk about some of the other ways that this same principle plays out throughout Leviticus 25, because at exactly the same time it says, for very much the same reasons, you are prohibited from using high interest loans to enrich yourself when a fellow Israelite needs money to avoid losing their home, losing their property, losing their freedom, and so forth. Leviticus 25 verses 35 through 38, it says, if your brother has become poor and his hand can't support himself among you, then you shall uphold him. He shall live with you like an alien and temporary resident. Take no interest from him or profit, but fear your God that your brother may live among you. You shall not lend him your money at interest, nor give him your food for profit. I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. So, it says in these same exact types of situations, when a fellow Israelite is in danger of losing their home, so they desperately need money, or they are in danger of losing their livestock or their fields or even their freedom, right? They're going to have to be indentured or something like that. They desperately need money, whatever the situation is. You are prohibited from enriching yourselves through their desperation using things like high interest loans. Now, this straight up prohibits using interest, period. But at that particular point in time, the norm for any type of loans, generally speaking, would have been extremely high interest. Think of almost like payday loans, right? You go and you get a payday loan so that you can pay your light bill this month, and yet by the time next month rolls around, you owe twice what you originally borrowed. By the time the next month after that rolls around, you owe, I don't even know what the math behind it is. But these are fundamentally predatory interest rates. They are taking advantage of the desperation that the person getting the loan is in order to make an insane amount of money off of them. And in the process, basically financially hobble them for the rest of their lives, a lot of the times. That was the norm for what loans tended to be like. We were not talking about little 1% interest rates or other things like that. We weren't even talking about, like a 33% APR or something like when you get a bad credit card. We are talking about something way more intense than that, just by default. And so, contextually speaking, if someone were to charge a much smaller, much more manageable rate of interest, would that have been forbidden in the same way that the kind of standard ancient Near Eastern predatory interest rates were forbidden here? I don't know. But the point is really not what rate of interest might theoretically have been allowed if they were allowed. The point is, it is inherently predatory to use the desperation of your fellow Israelite as a way of further significantly lining your pockets. They are desperately trying not to lose their home, and you are using it as an opportunity to vastly enrich yourself. They are desperately trying not to lose all the productive property that they have, and you are using it as a way of vastly enriching yourself. They are desperately trying not to end up as indentured servants for the next 49 years, and you are using it as a way to enrich yourself. What on earth is wrong with you? Seriously, what is your major malfunction? It says instead, because of the fact that God already generously helped you, now you generously help them. That's as simple as that. It says, I brought you out of the land of Egypt, so you get your fellow Israelite out of this emergency. It is that simple. You didn't deserve the help I gave to you. I don't care if they deserve your help. I helped you. You're not going to pay me back. You don't have a way. What you can do is help them, though. This is the fundamental principle here. And why is that? It's the same as the land monopoly issue. It is fundamentally contrary to God's purpose for all the land and animals and fields and productive property to be consolidated into fewer and fewer and fewer hands until everybody's living under a few people's thumb. And in the same way, it is fundamentally contrary to God's intent and design for everybody to gradually end up in debt to a handful of people. Because just like before with the land thing, that was the norm in the ancient Near East. Over generation after generation, almost every family, household, tribe, and so forth would end up in debt to just a few extremely wealthy, extremely powerful, extremely influential lenders. And so everybody is in debt to that one family, that one household. Everybody is forced to live on the land of that one family, that one household. Everybody is forced to tend to the crops of that one family, that one household. Everybody is forced to raise the livestock of that one family, that one household. They are basically the king, but there can only be one king, and that is Yahweh. And that same exact principle applies in a third way. It says you are prohibited from enslaving anyone who falls into unpayable debt to you. It says Leviticus 25:39-41, if your brother has grown poor among you and sells himself to you, you shall not make him to serve as a slave, as a hired servant and a temporary resident. He shall be with you. He shall serve you until the year of Jubilee. Then he shall go out from you, he and his children with him, and shall return to his own family and to the possession of his fathers. So if you are a lender, and someone has to take out a loan in order to avoid losing their house, losing their property, whatever the case is, and they have no way of paying it back, things just continue to go very badly, right? They continue to experience extremely hard financial times, and so on and so forth. And so that debt just cannot get paid. And eventually it comes to a point where there is simply no way they're going to be able to pay it back. You cannot do what the pagans do. What the pagans would do was eventually, when your debt gets high enough, when it becomes absolutely unpayable, and it becomes totally clear that you are never going to be able to pay what you owe, they would just enslave you, and your free labor as a slave becomes the means by which you pay your debt. But typically what would happen was you still wouldn't be able to pay your debt, because the interest would just keep piling up, and so your children end up also slaves. Your wife also ends up being a slave. But they will never be able to pay that debt either, because the interest continues to build up throughout your lifetime and their lifetime, and so eventually their own children become your slaves. And their children's children end up becoming your slaves, and their children's children's children end up becoming their slaves. Their family becomes a possession that is passed down from one generation after another to your family. Yahweh says you cannot do that in my covenant. He says instead, you will reflect me by shunning that system. He says, you may not enslave someone who falls into unpayable debt to you. All you may do, the absolute worst that you can do, is temporarily indenture them. Now, being an indentured servant was not a fun thing either, but it is a fundamentally different thing than being a kind of chattel slave. It says the absolute most you can do is take them temporarily as an indentured servant, but in the year of Jubilee, no more than 50 years from now, you have to set them free once again. However long it is until the year of Jubilee, that is it. And their debt is paid. Absolute worst case scenario, but much more commonly, as we've talked about before, it's not even going to be however many years it is until the year of Jubilee. That's the case for really extreme situations. Most situations, the absolute maximum that you can have someone as your servant, your indentured servant, your slave, for lack of better words, in ancient Israel was 7 years. In the 7th year, their debt was paid. It was over, period. So this actually is fundamentally this is the abolition of the ancient Near Eastern slave system as all of the ancient Near Eastern peoples had known it up to that point within the bounds of ancient Israel. But even for the period that you have someone as a servant, whether it is 6-7 years or it is 49-50 years, just depending on the situation, no matter how long you have them, you have to follow the extremely strict rules the Lord gave in Exodus for how you treat your slaves. Remember, this was not like early American pre-Civil War antebellum chattel slavery. In chattel slavery, in pre-Civil War America, you could basically do pretty much whatever you wanted to your slaves. They were quite literally straight up your property. Now, it didn't make financial sense to kill your slaves. It did not make financial sense to work your slaves so hard they just died right then and there, but plenty of stupid Southern slaveholders did it. Then, as in now, just because you're rich doesn't mean you're smart. And it was essentially only the rich who could actually own slaves in pre-Civil War America. The average poor Southern family did not have a slave. They could not afford to buy one in the first place, absolutely couldn't afford to support, feed, house, and so forth. So slavery in pre-Civil War America was mostly an institution for the wealthy, who ironically, also in pre-Civil War America, owned almost all the land, which was prohibited in the Old Testament system, held almost everybody else around them in unpayable debts, which was prohibited by the ancient Old Testament system, and so on and so forth. So actually every aspect of the pre-Civil War kind of slavery culture was a fundamental rebellion against the baseline principles laid out in the Old Testament. But this is fundamentally different than that. There were extremely strict rules that we saw in the book of Exodus about how you could treat your slaves. If you physically abuse your slaves, they are immediately set free and their debt is immediately considered paid, and you lose, period. If you block your slave from being able to find ways to pay for their freedom, then they are immediately set free and you immediately lose whatever debt balance they had that they owed to you. If you prevented your slaves from being able to get married and other things along those lines, you would lose your ability to continue to hold them as your slaves. If you did not provide adequate room and board, you would lose your slaves. They would be immediately set free. Their debt would immediately be paid. If you didn't provide adequate food and shelter and other things along those lines to your slaves, they would immediately be set free and their debt would be paid. I said it before, the average ancient Israelite slave had a more robust system of labor rights than some people living in some American states do. Your slaves were basically unionized. Your slaves were very, very vigorously protected by the Israelite government and so forth. Your slaves could straight up revolt against you if they needed to. It was not the norm, but you did not have anything like some kind of absolute power over your slaves in ancient Israelite. This was a system that could not just simply be abolished by fiat, and yet the Old Testament system regulated slavery into oblivion. It was honestly cheaper just to hire some workers than it was to acquire an indentured servant. And yet, at exactly the same time, it says even when you acquire a foreign slave, such as via war or conquest, right? If the Israelites are attacked by another country and they defeat them, in the ancient Near East, like we've talked about, the way that this worked was that the losing tribe, the losing nation, and so on and so forth, they become the slaves of the victorious tribe, the victorious nation, the victorious army. That was how it worked in the ancient Near East. And so the Israelites would have acquired quite a few foreign slaves when they attacked Israel and were defeated by Israel. And in those cases, as we saw in Exodus, you could permanently take them on as your family's servant or slave in a way that you could not with other Israelites. You could not with foreigners who entered into the covenant and became Israelites and so on and so forth. However, even in those cases, you still had to treat them with basic dignity. We talked in Exodus 21 as just one example. We're going to talk again in Deuteronomy 23 and so on and so forth. Pagan foreigners may not be in the covenant that the Lord made with Abraham, but they are still image bearers. Remember, the covenant God made with Abraham, that is the basis of all of the Mosaic laws. That's the basis of the anti-slavery laws here that protect everyone within the covenant. And yet, if you are not part of that covenant, then that covenant doesn't apply to you. And so those laws don't apply to you in quite the same way. And yet still, they are image bearers, and you are required to treat them with basic dignity. Leviticus 25, verses 44 through 46, it says, "As for your male and your female slaves, whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from the nations that are around you. You may also buy some of the children of the strangers who live as foreigners among you, and their families who are with you, which they have conceived in your land. They will be your property. You may make them an inheritance for your children after you to hold for a possession. You may take them as slaves forever, but over your brothers, the children of Israel, you shall not rule one over another with harshness." And so you could permanently own someone from the surrounding pagan nations. It was very common for the surrounding pagan nations to enslave their own people or enslave other people in conquest and then sell them to other nations. And often the ones that they could not sell, they would end up killing or simply working to death or using as human sacrifices or other things along those lines. And so, as strange as it sounds, actually, if the Israelites didn't buy these slaves that the surrounding pagan nations would come around to sell, somebody else would buy them from one of the other nations and typically treat them vastly worse. Or if nobody else bought them from one of these surrounding pagan nations, then often they would simply end up dead. In these cases, you could permanently hold them, but just like we've talked about all throughout Exodus and now Leviticus, and just like we will talk about in Numbers and Deuteronomy, you were still required to treat these foreign slaves with a level of care and dignity that was unheard of in the ancient Near East. You still had to treat them like human beings, even when legally and functionally they were considered your property. As weird as it sounds, one of the best things that could ever happen to you if you were an ancient Near Eastern slave was to get sold to someone in Israelite. But we are still not done. There is still more that we need to talk about here, because in very much the same way, there is another seemingly very strange law, and that is the law of the Sabbath year. Leviticus 25 says, "All of the land all of the animals, all of the workers must rest every 7th year during the Sabbath year. So Leviticus 25 verses 3 through 7, it says, 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its fruits. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to Yahweh. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. What grows of itself in your harvest you shall not reap, and you shall not gather the grapes of your undressed vine. It shall be a year of solemn rest for the land. The Sabbath of the land shall be for food for you, for yourself, for your servant, for your maid, for your hired servant, and for your stranger who lives as a foreigner with you, for your livestock also, and for the animals that are in your land shall all its increase be for food. This is a pretty radical concept that it's pretty difficult for us to really wrap our heads around. Every 7th year, absolutely every part of society must rest. Quite literally, in the 7th year, you must rest and recover from the previous 6 years. Obviously, there were things that there was literally no way to avoid having to do. You can't avoid going out and feeding your animals. You can't avoid, other stuff like that, but you couldn't do any avoidable work. You couldn't do any work that was not absolutely necessary. For an entire year, it was as if every day was the Sabbath, and you had to live on the food that you had stored up over the previous 6 years in your storehouses. In the same way, you could not force your animals to work. You could not force your servants or slaves or hired workers to work. You couldn't force anybody to work. You had to rest. Everybody in your household had to rest. All of your resources had to rest. You had to just let everything be still. Let everything recover. And when you do this, you are reflecting the goodness and the glory of the Lord, who created us to rest, and who is ultimately working through the long-promised Savior who is coming to bring a permanent and eternal rest for all of his people in the end. That is where his redeeming and restoring work is headed. It is headed for an eternal rest in the new heavens and the new earth, when he redeems humanity and restores our world, undoes the fall, unbreaks the world, puts everything right again. And because all of these things are true, right? Because we have a God who owns all the land, all the animals, all the harvests, all the people, and who created us to be self-sustaining, and who we can trust to provide for us year after year, and who has called us to live in such a way that it reflects these gloriously good things. Because all those things are true, we need to relate to our stuff in a way that reflects it. We need to relate to our land, relate to our homes, relate to our animals, relate to our crops, relate to our money, relate to our children, relate to our workers, our servants, and on and on and on. We need to relate to all of these things in a way that reflects the fact that we have a God who owns all of it, has entrusted it to us for a purpose, and can be trusted to provide for us. And that is the thing that is lying behind one of the weirdest sections in Leviticus, which is saying something because there is a lot of weird stuff happening in Leviticus. I am going to talk about Leviticus 27 before I get deep into Leviticus 26, and you're gonna see why in just a moment. I know that's kind of annoying if you are, like watching little bits of these videos at a time as you read each chapter. But Leviticus 27 is still happening kind of on the same big wavelength and train of thought as Leviticus 25. I know we've talked about this before, but just the way that they tended to organize their thoughts and organize their ideas and so on and so forth in the ancient Near East was just different than the way that we tend to. If Leviticus had been written in 2026, then chapter 27 would probably have been placed before chapter 26. Because as modern Westerners, we tend to think in very linear fashion. And that's simply not how the ancient Near Eastern peoples tended to think. But as a result, for a lot of people, maybe, if you finished all of Leviticus already, then there's a good chance that when you finish Leviticus 26, you're like, okay, well, that seems kind of like the end point. And then Leviticus 27 happened, and you're like, why are we talking about this now? Why is this the ending of this book? What's going on? If you read a lot of commentaries on Leviticus, they will refer to chapter 27 as an appendix. And I guess that's not exactly wrong, but I think it sort of misses the point. Because it's not that Leviticus 27 is just sort of an appendix on this random topic that they had to stick somewhere. And what is happening is that as ancient Near Eastern peoples, they just tend not to be ultra-linear thinkers. And so it didn't really strike them as weird for chapter 27 to be at the very end, when it would have flown in a more linear way if it were chapter 26 and chapter 26 were chapter 27 or something else along those lines. And so there's all kinds of debate among biblical scholars about why Leviticus 27 was placed at the end instead of somewhere else in the book, since chapter 26 feels like the natural endpoint. But whatever the exact reason is, it is following along with kind of the train of thought of Leviticus 25. It is still kind of plumbing the depths of what it looks like to live as if your God is the one who owns all things, including you, and who has a good purpose for all of your things, which he owns. So let's talk about that. Leviticus 27 is all about vows that you make to the Lord, which in itself already is very strange to us because this is something that we don't really have as much of a concept of in our own culture. It's kind of like we've talked about the ritual purity versus ritual impurity is not really a concept that we have in modern Western culture. In the same way, we don't have anywhere near as much of a concept of making vows to the Lord, vowing something to the Lord. Vowing your house to the Lord, vowing your child to the Lord, vowing your animals or whatever to the Lord. That's not something you typically see happen very often in modern Western culture. And so we have to bridge a little bit of the cultural distance here. So if you read this chapter and you're like, I don't know what on God's green earth this is talking about, you're not stupid. This is a genuinely extremely unfamiliar cultural thing. But just like with all the other extremely unfamiliar cultural things we saw throughout Exodus and now Leviticus, and that we will see in Numbers and Deuteronomy, this is actually not random. It's not arbitrary. What is happening here, as always, is God is using a common ancient Near Eastern custom as a teaching tool. You've heard me say that a million times at this point between Genesis and now, but it's still true. God is using the ancient Near Eastern custom of vowing certain possessions or lands or houses or even children or family members to the local god or the tribal god and so forth. He's using that common ancient Near Eastern custom as a teaching tool to help the ancient Israelites understand important things about himself and their relationship with him. So he's taken something that the ancient Israelites would already understand. They would already understand vowing your son to the Lord, vowing your house to the Lord, vowing an acre of your land to the Lord, blah, 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 blah. They would already understand that. He's using this thing that they already understand in order to teach them things they don't quite understand yet. So let's talk about that common ancient Near Eastern custom, because it's wild. In the ancient Near East, it was unbelievably common. Trying to think of an example of something super common today that might seem weird to somebody else, but I'm drawing a blank, right? But it was unbelievably common in the ancient Near East to make a vow to the local deity in exchange for something. You would say, do this and I will give you that field. Do that and I will give you that animal. Do this and I will give you that house. Do that and I will give you that child. Whatever the specific thing was, it was as if you were giving the local god or gods something very important and valuable to you so that they would do something that was even more advantageous for you. Now, an important thing that we need to talk about is the fact that in the ancient Near East, the ancient pagans often would use vows in a very specific way. These vows that they were making were, I'm trying to think of the best way to put it. I'm trying to be fair, but the entire system of kind of making these trade-in vows to the local gods, it was essentially a form of manipulating the gods. This was a way of getting the gods to do what you wanted. So this was essentially, fundamentally, a warped and twisted way of relating to the divine. If there is a god of some sort, then you as a human, as the worshiper, you need to do what that God wants you to do. That God does not need to do a dang thing you want it to do. But these vows to the local gods, they were ways of getting the gods to do what you wanted. They were ways of manipulating the gods into carrying out your will. And so before anything else, part of what's happening here is that Yahweh is taking this extremely common ancient Near Eastern custom that it was baked into the ancient Near Eastern mindset, and he is already changing something very important. Essentially, what Leviticus says is you must not rashly, hastily, unthinkingly make vows to Yahweh as a way of trying to gain power or advantage for yourself. You must not rashly or hastily make vows to Yahweh as a way of trying to manipulate Yahweh into carrying out your will, empowering you, enriching you, raising you up over others and stuff like that. Instead, vows that you make to Yahweh, if you're gonna do it, then it needs to be a free act of devotion. If you're going to make some kind of vow to Yahweh, if you're going to vow your land or your animal or whatever to Yahweh, then it needs to just be a free act of worship. You can make vows to Yahweh in order to worship Him, in order to honor Him, in order to show your gratitude to Him. You know, think of like the free will offerings, stuff like that. You can do things along those lines, but you may not hastily make a vow to Yahweh in order to just kind of bend Him into carrying out your will. And the way that it does that is that it adds a whole bunch of stipulations in that basically remove the incentive. It basically makes vows to the Lord very difficult. It makes these types of vows to the Lord like prohibitively complicated, basically. I know it sounds weird, but actually, like, these are actively going out of their way. These rules are actively kind of intended to make it more trouble than it's worth, to try to trade some vow of a field or an animal or a child or whatever to the Lord for favors from the Lord. For example, it says Leviticus 27:28, no devoted thing that a man devotes to Yahweh of all that he has, whether man or animal or the field of his possession, shall be sold or redeemed. Every devoted thing is made holy to Yahweh. Essentially what it means is if you hastily make some kind of vow to the Lord, you say, Lord, if you will do this, then I will give you that field. If you will do this, then I will give you this child, and so on and so forth. If you hastily do that and then realize, no, wait, I cannot go without that field. I cannot afford to get rid of that. I cannot go without this child as a pair of hands on the farm, and so on and so forth. You can buy it back, but you can't use it for anything else ever again. Once you've vowed that field to the Lord, you can never use it for agriculture again. You can never use it for your business again. You can never use it to build a home on again. If you hastily vow it to the Lord, even if you buy it back, it is basically no longer of any use to you. The point here is just to make it more trouble than it's worth to do this thing that is like what the ancient pagans did. In the same way, it makes it prohibitively difficult to try to trade some vow for favors from the Lord, by making it so that in those cases when you have to buy back something that you vowed to the Lord, it's extremely expensive. Leviticus 27:11-13, it says, if it is any unclean animal of which they do not offer as an offering to Yahweh, then he shall set the animal before the priest, and the priest shall evaluate it, whether it is good or bad. As the priest evaluates it, so shall it be. But he will, or if he will indeed redeem it, or buy it back, then he shall add the 5th part to its valuation. Essentially, if you unexpectedly fall on hard times after you vow your child or your animal or your field or your house or whatever to the Lord, you can get them back by paying the redemption price, but the redemption price was extremely steep. You would add 20% to the original valuation, so it's way more expensive to buy back something you have vowed to the Lord, which then you can't use for any of the things you originally would have needed to use it for. What it's basically doing here is saying, okay, don't even try to use vows to the Lord as a way of getting the Lord to fulfill your goals, your will, your desires, giving you an advantage over other people. The only kind of vows to the Lord that are even worth the trouble of making are just like free will vows that you make just out of gratitude to the Lord in order to honor the Lord, as an act of worship to the Lord, as a free act of devotion. Basically says, hey, the party is over. The old false gods that you grew up with might have done things like this, but Yahweh does not. At the same time, another important thing is that in the ancient Near Eastern culture, that kind of normalized these vows that you would make, sort of trading with the local god, usually involved human sacrifice. But here in Leviticus it says vows to Yahweh cannot incorporate human sacrifice. You can devote a child to the Lord, but when you devote a child to the Lord, you don't sacrifice him to Yahweh. Instead, your child gets brought into tabernacle service. Basically, your child will become one of the people who helps the priests with the tabernacle rituals in some way. If you devote one of your animals to the Lord, typically that animal will become maybe one of the sacrifices or something like that. Or in some other way, it'll be doing some kind of work that is part of the tabernacle. You devote one of your houses or one of your fields or part of your property or whatever, it essentially just goes to the priests and they'll allocate it in whatever way is needed at the time. But what you cannot do is sacrifice a human being to the Lord. He does not want your human sacrifice. And so they will measure out sort of the value of whatever or whoever you are devoting to the Lord. And they'll value it out based on their projected labor, sort of their economic value, so to speak. Like if it's a girl of this age, then you would probably have gotten sort of this economic value out of her labor on your farm. If it's a boy of this age, then you would probably have gotten this sort of economic value out of his labor on your farm, and so on and so forth. Same thing with animals, same thing with fields, same thing with houses, and so forth. But you can't offer your child as a sacrifice. He says, you cannot do this the way the pagans do. In the same way, you cannot vow your firstborn child to the Lord because, as we already saw in the book of Exodus, your firstborn child is already mandatorily devoted to Yahweh. You cannot vow your firstborn animal to the Lord because, as we saw already, the firstborn among your livestock are already devoted to Yahweh. They already go to temple service, and on and on and on. In the same way, you cannot consider any of your mandatory tithes as a vow to the Lord because, as we are going to see all throughout Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, The tithes that the ancient Israelites owed were already mandatorily devoted to the Lord. In the same way, it says you can only vow land that you permanently own. You can only vow homes that you permanently own. You cannot permanently devote land that you acquired from somebody else defaulting on their debt or other things like that to the Lord until the day of Jubilee. When the day of Jubilee comes, whatever land you acquired by somebody else going bankrupt and foreclosing is going back to their family, even if you dedicate it to the Lord. And that's going to factor into the value of that land or house or whatever in the dedication process. And of course, naturally, it says you cannot strategically choose the worst animals, the worst crops, the worst children to serve as your vows or your tithes. If you vow your least useful child to the Lord, that's just a no. It's a no. That's not cool. If you vow the worst part of your land to the Lord, no. If you try to value your least productive animal to the Lord, no. Instead, it says you've got to give honestly. Leviticus 27 verses 32 and 33. All the tithe of the herds or the flocks, whatever passes under the rod, the tenth shall be holy to the Lord. He shall not search whether it is good or bad, neither shall he change it. If he changes it at all, then both it and that for which it is changed shall be holy. It shall not be redeemed. It says, if you realize, oh no, that's my best animal, I can't devote that one, and you try to switch it out with one of your bad ones, then the priest needs to take both the best one and the bad ones. You need to be penalized for that. The point of all of this is very simple. It is to strongly discourage you from even trying to make some kind of bargain with God. It says, look, God is not going to help you in exchange for you giving him some of your land. He's not going to help you in exchange for you giving him one of your kids. He's not going to help you in exchange for you giving him one of your animals. You can devote something to the Lord, but if you do, it needs to just be a free act of worship. Why? Because God doesn't need any of your stuff. God's not hungry. God's not poor. God doesn't need land. God already owns everything. God already owns everyone. God already owns you. And the reason that he owns everything, everyone, and you is because of who he is and because of what he has done. And this God who owns everything, everywhere, all the time, including you, has made a covenant with you. And that covenant is the basis of everything about your life. With him. We are finally now backtracking to chapter 26. Because chapter 26 is, you could kind of say, the heart of the book of Leviticus. Chapter 26 is the core, it's the fundamental reality that all the rest of Leviticus flows out from. This chapter is a massive reiteration of the covenant God has made with his people. And this covenant is the basis for all of these rules. This covenant is the basis for all these laws. It's the basis for all these rituals, all these ceremonies, all these practices. They are all rooted in this covenant. And so as Leviticus is coming near to its close, the Lord reminds the ancient Israelites of this covenant that he has made with them by his grace. But he explains this covenant in a way that would have made sense to these ancient Near Easterners in ancient Israel. The way he does that is he models the way he explains the covenant, like we've talked about before, on ancient Near Eastern vassal suzerain treaties. We talked about in the past, vassal suzerain treaties were very common in ancient Near Eastern culture. A powerful nation or a powerful king, they would call them the suzerain, would make a kind of treaty or agreement or covenant with smaller, weaker nations, tribes, peoples, and so forth, that essentially the suzerain would protect the vassals, and the vassals would be loyal to the suzerain. That was the fundamental kind of model in the ancient Near East. And so God models the way he explains his covenant on that. He says, Leviticus 26, 3 and 4, if you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and do them, I will give you, and then he lists off a whole bunch of things. Then he says in Leviticus 26, 14 through 16, if you will not listen to me and will not do all these commandments, if you shall reject my statutes and your soul abhors my ordinances so that you will not do all my commandments, but break my covenant, then I will do these things to you. This is the way that ancient vassal suzerain treaties worked. This would have made sense to the ancient Israelites. And so he models it on that. He uses something they do already understand in order to help them wrap their minds around something they wouldn't understand yet. But he says absolutely everything about our life as God's people is rooted in our covenant relationship with Yahweh. Yahweh is the basis of all of these things. So Leviticus 26, 12 and 13 says, I will walk among you and will be your God, and you will be my people. I am Yahweh your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that you should not be their slaves. I have broken the bars of your yoke and made you walk upright. Everything about our life as God's people is rooted in our covenant relationship with him. He's made a covenant with us. He has rescued us from slavery in Egypt, and he has promised he will rescue us from our truest and deepest slavery to death and sin. He will redeem humanity and restore our world. And because he is our covenant God, therefore he's entitled to our exclusive worship. We must not make him compete with any idols. Leviticus 26:1 says, you shall make for yourselves no idols, and you shall not raise up an engraved image or a pillar, and you shall not place any figured stone in your land to bow down to it, for I am Yahweh your God. He's entitled to our exclusive worship. He's not just worthy of our worship, but he is entitled to the worship that is due to the God of the universe and the worship that is due to the God who has covenanted himself with us. And one of the ways that we signal that outwardly is by revering him, revering his presence, revering the sanctuary that symbolizes his presence. He says, Leviticus 26:2, you shall have reverence for my sanctuary. It's not because there's anything special about the building. It's because the sanctuary is an image of the presence of God. It says you must revere the sanctuary that represents my presence, and it says you must practice the Sabbath I've given you as an expression of your submission to me. That same verse, Leviticus 26:2, you shall keep my Sabbaths and have reverence for my sanctuary. I am Yahweh. Revering the sanctuary signals I revere him. Keeping his Sabbaths signals I am in submission to this God the sanctuary represents. The point of all this is absolutely everything about our life as his people is rooted in our covenant relationship with him. Therefore, he's entitled to our exclusive worship. And so, he lists off a long list of blessings that come with being God's people. This is a long list of blessings specifically that come with being God's people on God's mission at that particular moment in history. So the old covenant nation of Israel were God's people on his mission in that form at that moment in history. And there are certain blessings that were necessary in order to function as his people on his mission at that point in time. The first was sustenance and provision through the rains and the harvests. Leviticus 26, 3-5, if you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and do them, I will give you rain in its season, and the land shall yield its increase, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. Your threshing shall reach the vintage, and the vintage shall reach the sowing time. You shall eat your bread to the full and dwell in your land safely. Number one, He provided sustenance and provision through rains, harvests, and so on and so forth in such a way that made it easier for them to carry out his mission in the world. Number 2, it says protection from enemies, including like dangerous animals and even like internal strife. So enemies outside and inside. It says Leviticus 26:6, I will give you peace in the land, and you shall lie down, and no one will make you afraid. I will remove evil animals out of the land. Neither the sword shall go through your land. When the Lord protects his people from enemies, it makes it easier for them to carry out his mission. When he protected his people from internal strife, it made it easier to carry out his mission. And so on and so forth. Same thing. Number 3, one of the blessings that came with his covenant was supernatural empowerment to defeat the external threats and conquerors. Leviticus 26:7-8 says, you shall chase your enemies, and they shall fall before you by the sword. 5 of you shall chase 100. 100 of you shall chase 10,000, and your enemy shall fall before you by the sword. He's saying, I will empower you to fulfill my mission by empowering you to defeat everyone who would attempt to conquer you. Number 4, he says fruitfulness, fertility, an abundance of healthy children. That's Leviticus 26:9. It says, I will make you fruitful, multiply you, and will establish my covenant with you. It says, I am going to multiply your people. I will make you an abundant people, a fertile people. You will literally outbreed the surrounding pagan nations in a way that makes it easier for you to fulfill my mission that I have given you. Number 5, he says, you'll have excess food and supplies. You will lack nothing. Says Leviticus 26:10, you shall eat old supplies long kept. You shall move out the old because of the new. You are going to have enough to eat. You're going to have more than enough to eat. You're going to have enough to save. You're going to have enough to share. You're going to have enough that you can throw things away, and it's not going to be a problem. Number 6, above all of these things, more than anything else, I will empower you to carry out my covenant mission through my own presence and faithfulness. Leviticus 26:11-12. I will set my tent among you, and my soul won't abhor you. I will walk among you and will be your God, and you will be my people. All of these blessings, they're not arbitrary. It's not just, I like you more, so I'm going to give you a lot of food, make you very fruitful and fertile and abundant, help you beat your enemies and so forth. The point is, these help ancient Israel fulfill their role in God's covenant mission. They are not simply like rewards for faithfulness. These are tools in their hands that make them effective as God's people sent out on mission to the surrounding pagan nations to draw them away from false worship of their false gods and into true worship of the true God. When they see these blessings coming in response to their faithfulness, they will have no choice but to say, the God of the universe is with them, and I want to go worship that God too. And so this is very important for us to understand. God is not saying, if you follow these rules, then I will save you. We've already talked about the fact that God saved his people first and then gave them his covenant rules. Remember, Leviticus 26:13. He says, I am Yahweh your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. I already redeemed you from Egypt. I already saved you from Egypt. I already made you my people. I'm already Yahweh your God. I've already broken the bars of your slavery. Now I'm giving you these commands. The point is not that their faithfulness will earn the blessings that are listed here. The point is unfaithfulness will block the blessings. Unfaithfulness will sabotage these blessings in the same way that their unfaithfulness will block the mission they were sent to do. It will sabotage the mission that these blessings are meant to help them with. That's why Yahweh says, if you will not listen to me and will not do all these commandments, if you will reject my statutes and your soul abhors my ordinances so that you will not do my commands but break my covenant, then I will do these bad things to you. What he's saying is, I'm going to train you. All the bad things that he's about to lay out, these are training. These are teaching. He says, I'm going to train you that if you follow me faithfully, these blessings are what comes. And if you are unfaithful, these bad things are what comes. He says, I'm going to train my people to follow me faithfully by sabotaging their worldly pursuits when they persistently, unrepentantly rebel. So the goal is that generation after generation, when his people in ancient Israel faithfully followed him, faithfully carried out his mission, he would pour out these blessings in a way that helped them carry out the mission and reinforced, hey, you were on the right track. But when they persistently rebelled against him, it would sabotage those blessings, and instead it would bring these discipline. He gives a handful of examples of what this discipline is going to look like. He said, number one, you will experience agricultural collapse. Leviticus 26:18-20. If you, in spite of these things, will not listen to me, then I will chastise you 7 times more for your sins. I will break the pride of your power. I will make your sky like iron and your soil like bronze. Your strength will be spent in vain. Your land won't yield its increase. Neither will the trees of the land yield their fruit. That's agricultural collapse. And agricultural collapse, inevitably, that progresses into number 2, poverty. It says Leviticus 26:20. Your strength will be spent in vain. Your land won't yield its increase. Neither will the trees yield their fruit. That is extreme poverty brought on by agricultural collapse, which inevitably progresses into famine. Leviticus 26:26, when I break your staff of bread, 10 women shall bake your bread in one oven, and they shall deliver your bread again by weight. You shall eat and not be satisfied. He's using language here that you would use to describe just famine, where so many people are having to subsist on one tiny little bit of bread. One oven will feed 10 people, not because it's a real productive oven, but because that's all you can get. That's extreme famine, and famine inevitably progresses into what? Disease. Leviticus 26:25. I will bring a sword upon you that will execute the vengeance of the covenant. You'll be gathered together within your cities, and I will send the pestilence among you. You will be delivered into the hand of the enemy. So much of the population will be weakened and succumb to disease, which inevitably progresses to what? Conquest. Says Leviticus 26:32-33, I will bring the land into desolation, and your enemies that dwell therein will be astonished at it. I will scatter you among the nations, and I will draw out the sword after you. Your land will be a desolation, and your cities shall be a waste. In your weakened state, after the famine, after the poverty, after the agricultural collapse, you will be conquered. And as a result of that conquest, you will experience exile. Leviticus 26:33, I will scatter you among the nations. I will draw out the sword after you. Your land will be a desolation, and your city shall be a waste. This is the discipline process by which the Lord will get his people back on track when they persistently rebel and wander away. But none of this discipline is abandonment. All of this discipline is meant to draw the rebellious Israelites to repentance and restoration. That's why Leviticus 26:40-42 says, but if they confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers in their trespass, which they trespassed against me, and also that because they walked contrary to me, I also walked contrary to them and brought them into the land of their enemies. If then their uncircumcised heart is humbled and they then accept the punishment of their iniquity, then I will remember my covenant with Jacob, my covenant with Isaac, and also my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. So the purpose of the blessings is actually not reward. The purpose of the blessings is to aid God's people on God's mission. And the purpose of the curses is actually not wrath. It's discipline, meant to redirect his people away from their rebellion and back to his mission. That is what all these things are rooted in and pointing towards and preparing his people for. That is the book of Leviticus. Now, there may be other things that we didn't get to dive deep into that you still have questions about, so hit me up with whatever questions you have either in the comments of this video or in the Let's Read Scripture Together Facebook group, and I will tackle them as soon as I get the chance. I will see you in the next video when we dive into the book of Numbers. We are making progress. I'm excited. But between now and then, I love you guys. Take care and keep reading.